I'm sorry I didn't start recording yet. So feel free to ask questions or make comments at any point throughout the presentation by typing your question in the question box and clicking send. If you cannot see the question box, click on the orange box with the white arrow in the upper right corner of your screen to open the question box area, and Michelle will be answering questions that you submit at the end of the presentation. Also, handouts from today's presentation can be downloaded from your control panel under the tab that says Handouts. Michelle Antle completed her undergraduate degree at Kentucky Wesleyan College in Owensboro, Kentucky, and her Ed.S. degree in the field of school psychology. In 2011, Michelle was named Kentucky School Psychologist of the Year. She has worked as a school psychologist in public schools for 11 years and also has experience in the mental health field through serving as an autism coordinator for Family Options, Inc., and working with children and families through the Impact Plus program. In her current role at KATC, Michelle provides direct training and technical assistance to education staff, social and community personnel, counselors, job coaches, and families. And without further ado, I'd like to switch the screen over to our presenter today, Michelle Antle. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning. I'm having a hard time seeing the switch. Let's see.
Okay.
All right.
There you go. I can see your screen.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. This morning we're going to be talking about how to use task analysis and how that is going to be a key to successful learning. Some of the objectives that we're going to address today, I'm going to give you a basic overview about what task analysis is, and mainly to teach you how to learn how to break down a concept into smaller parts to make it more likely that an individual is going to succeed at learning that complex task. We're also going to talk about what skills can be appropriately taught using task analysis. I'll be showing you some different examples, and we're going to talk about 3 main procedures for teaching behavioral behaviors in a chain. So hopefully you will walk away with new knowledge that you've not had before. So task analysis is defined as the process of breaking a skill down into smaller, more manageable parts or steps in order to teach a more complex skill. So we really don't realize, but we do this every day when we work with a multitude of different learners. So we might start by simply, when we're toilet training, we may start by simply getting them to sit on the toilet. That's one small part in the larger chain of things. Then also working on, then pulling their pants down or pulling their pants up. So each one of those are smaller or discrete skills that have to be formally taught and then thus chained together to make one larger task. So the sequence of behaviors that one might perform is not going to be identical from one situation to another. So even though some of the general steps of toileting or teeth brushing might be the same, we might differ a little bit in the order in which we do a few of those, or it might be that we're going to break it down into more smaller, succinct parts for some individuals, while others might be able to cluster some of those smaller parts together. So it's going to be completely and totally individualized. When we're looking at task analysis, we're going to look at the age of the individual, what skill set that they currently perform at, what success that they have had in learning, what environments they're most successful in. So pretty much overall just the prior experience of that individual that we're going to be teaching. So why we would use task analysis is obviously sometimes those tasks require so many different steps that it's just too overwhelming or too cumbersome to learn all of those together. So breaking those things down into those smaller parts and then teaching each one of those steps independently is more manageable for a lot of our individuals. So once we're able to successfully teach each of those individual skills, then we can what we call chain them together to complete that more complex task. Anyone can benefit from using task analysis. Like I said, many of us do this in our day-to-day lives. If we have something as simple as a new coffee pot that we've never used before, sometimes it seems like it would be easy to learn, but then it doesn't exactly work the way that we need it to. So we get out our handy-dandy instruction book and we open it up, and there may be, 20 12 steps and we know, well, I can scan through the first 4 because I've already done that. So many times our handouts or handbooks that come with different appliances are going to have all of these task analysis kind of spelled out for us as well. So the research, if you look at it specifically, documents that task analysis is effective with children, youth, and adolescents, specifically with autism spectrum disorders. And if you look and take a deeper dive into the research, it specifically has application for preschool, elementary, and middle school age children. But as I said, we also have to assume, because we utilize these own strategies in our daily living as adults, that obviously these strategies are effective for more than that. These are just the populations that are represented in Dr. Wong's research. So what settings can task analysis be used in? Any. Home, community, school, any environment in which that individual is going to have to perform that specific task. And a really important point is that the more settings that you are practicing these skills in and are teaching these skills in, the more likely that generalization is to occur. We know that with our students with autism that generalization from one environment to another or from one person to another is often difficult for them. So getting them to practice these skill sets in each of these different environments is really crucial for them having mastery of that particular skill and then therefore being able to perform that skill independently in a variety of those settings or with a variety of people. So let's get started. What are some of, we're going to talk about 5 major steps that are included and some considerations for each. When we're starting to get started with a task analysis, we obviously need to start by determining what skill it is that we would like to teach. So what's going to be our target? So there could be a variety of targets that we use. Oftentimes many academic skills, we think about using task analysis within a school setting, but that also can be applied to the home setting as well, because as we talked about, generalization is important. And sometimes the steps that we might teach, for example, writing or another academic skill in the school setting may be different or look different. That task analysis would look different in the home setting, just simply because maybe they need more supports. Many of our students learn that, oh, well, in school, this is exactly what I exhibit. And then they come home and think, no, this is not where I want to perform this skill, or this looks like a foreign concept to me. So first of all, recognizing that task analysis, it's important to try to teach each of these steps and write them out, but that some of these analysis may look different across settings. We also use it a lot to teach self-help skills, or what we call adaptive skills, that ability to form or perform independently. So it could be things such as getting dressed, brushing our teeth, learning to shave. All of those might be included. And then in the community setting, many of the life skills that we have, how would I shop for groceries, or how would I go about introducing myself at a doctor's appointment to say that I'm here to see a doctor? What steps might I take? Also, communication skills. Sometimes we don't think about communication as needing to be broken down into smaller parts, but something as simple as knowing how to start a conversation can be a more complex task for many of our individuals. So outlining, maybe it's that I approach the party, look at them in the eyes, and then, ask my question. Maybe it could be something that's specific, or maybe some overall general communication, other communication or social skills like learning to read nonverbal languages in people and adjust our behaviors accordingly. Also, we can teach social skills, so things like playing with a peer, learning to play a game, for example, turn taking, what the expectations are. Also, maybe holiday types of things like what to expect at Halloween, how do I trick or treat, or how do I perform or participate in an Easter egg hunt. So a variety of different skills can be targeted. The important thing that we need to remember is that target skills should consist of a series of chained steps, so not a single independent skill. And what I mean by that is a chained skill are things that are several smaller steps that have to be done in a specific sequence in order to complete a certain task. When I say a discrete type of task, that means that it requires only one response. So a single clap may be a discrete task, or putting an item into a bucket. That would be a discrete task where there's not a sequence of events that would actually be required. So again, knowing that you're going to teach the discrete skills in smaller parts, but then obviously chain them together to have that larger sequence to complete a more complex task, such as teeth brushing. So from there, we need to move on to step 2, which would be to determine what prerequisite skills are needed for our individual to be able to complete the skill that we have targeted. So it's really important to observe the child, see what skills they already demonstrate independently, so that we're not spending a lot of mundane time or wasting time teaching things that they already know. But also to see how they interact with their environment, what materials might be more efficient for them to use if they prefer, maybe they're right-hand dominant instead of left-hand dominant. Some of those observations are really important when we start to look at how we're going to teach things within that chain. So we also do what we call collect baseline data. So that could be as simple as doing some observations, or maybe it's that we observe the child to see how much of, maybe what percentage of a total task, how many steps that they're able to complete on their own independently, or how much is required, an individual is required to be prompted through that type of thing. So, maybe also looking at their skill sets. Does my student have the fine motor skills required to hold a pencil if we are going to be teaching them to write their name? And a lot of times people don't see writing their name as being a chained type of skill, but if you think about it, first of all, you have to know that, paper is for writing and a pencil, or for writing on, and a pencil is for writing. And then you have to know that, there's a specific place on the paper that you need to write. And maybe that those letters have specific sizes. They need to know what their letters actually are. We need to know that they know what their name is so that they can put those letters together and be able to formulate that on the page. So many prerequisite skills sometimes are skipped over, and we don't realize that that's the reason our individuals are not being successful, is that there are skills that they need to know beforehand that they are missing. So also within this step, you're going to provide a list of materials that are going to be needed to teach that specific target skill. So again, if we're going to be working with money and then purchasing items, let's say in a grocery store, then it's important for us to consider, do we need to use actual money or actual coins, or could we use fake coins or pictures of money? At what level are our individuals functioning and that they would comprehend exactly what it is that's going to take place. For some of our individuals, they actually need to be in the setting in which they're going to practice these target skills. Having a pretend environment set up at home or in a school is not quite enough. They actually need to be physically in that environment to understand that this particular order of events has to occur. Or maybe that they only use those prerequisite skills in that particular environment. So getting a list of materials that are going to be needed is going to be very helpful. This also helps us plan our intervention. So when we're working with that individual, we make sure that we have all of our materials on hand instead of having to scrounge around and find those types of things after we're trying to get started. If there are too many prerequisite skills that are missing, it may be necessary for you to kind of take a step back and maybe think, okay, maybe we're not ready for this specific target skill, or maybe we're only going to teach, let's say, the first 3 steps instead of working on, ultimately getting, 8 steps chained together. And for some of our individuals, even getting and teaching 2 smaller, discrete skills or steps, may be very time consuming. I've worked with some individuals where you can teach those steps in a matter of minutes, whereas other individuals that it's required months for them to be able to obtain just 1 step within that task analysis or sequence in which we're trying to focus on. If you would like some more information, I would encourage you to go to the Autism Internet modules. The citation is there in the bottom left-hand corner of your slide. The Autism Internet modules are free. All it requires is for you to create a login and a password, and you're able to log in and obtain additional information about this specific evidence-based practice task analysis, as well as a wide variety of other things. on the left-hand side of your screen, once you would log into those Autism Internet modules, you can click on the setting in which you work. So it could be autism in the home, autism in the classroom, autism in the community, and then it could give you some specific examples for each of those environments that might be more applicable and get you kind of a more firmer understanding if you'd like some more formal examples and more formal explanations. So I always like to give free resources out to our participants so that that way they can access additional information if needed. And as always, you're welcome to email myself or any of the other field training coordinators at the KATC. So step number 3 is sometimes the most cumbersome, and unfortunately we don't think of it being so, but it really requires a lot of planning and thought, and that is to list out each step of the target skill in which we're going to train. So sometimes things that you and I may informally think, well, there's only 3 or 4 steps to that. Once you actually sit down to write it out, there may be more like 12, 13, or 14. So I encourage each of you to grab a pencil, paper, grab a Word document, type those specific skills out, and then really kind of think about, what type of prerequisite skills, does my student have, but also think further of, washing, maybe if you're thinking about washing your hands, making sure that our individuals know that if there's a, that they need to dry their hands on a towel. What happens if the towel is not out on the counter? Would they know how to look? So sometimes our task analysis can be a little bit more specific after and look different, from the initial task analysis that we teach, to include things such as, oh, well, there's not a towel, so where might I look for one of those in a bathroom setting? It's also very helpful, and I would encourage you to have another professional or another parent or another individual that works with your child to look over the steps of your task analysis just to ensure accuracy. Sometimes we get so involved and focused on a specific task or a task analysis that we sometimes miss something, or it might be in a different order. And that's okay. Sometimes people are going to see things that you may not, and that's why we encourage those third-party people to kind of review over that information. One time there was a student that we worked with, and we were using visual supports to try to teach them the toileting process. And unbeknownst to us, we did not catch it, but by accident, we had actually put pulled down underwear before we had pulled down pants. And so the child kept looking at us like we were crazy in terms of how am I going to pull down my underwear first when they're on the underneath side of my pants. So sometimes just having professionals look at it and catch it can be really helpful so that we don't confuse our learners. And as I mentioned before, excuse me, it's possible that you may have to break down steps even farther. So for example, pulling down pants. That seems like a really generalized or an easy skill, but sometimes our kids with fine motor difficulties aren't able to formally grasp the waistband of their pants or have the motor control that would be required to pull those pants up or down. So spending a lot more time actually focusing on that discrete part of the skill may be more important than utilizing that in a larger chain of events. So these are some examples, and again, there's some citations here with some examples, but you can get more of examples like these from the Autism Internet modules. So I want everyone to take a look and just kind of look through these 21 steps of teeth brushing. And one of the discussions that I've had with many individuals when I've worked in the home setting is that we all almost brush our teeth differently. For many of us, we need to wet our toothbrush first before we would put the toothpaste on. So consider what that order might be different in some homes than another. So it's really important that if a mom is going to be working with an individual every morning on these teeth brushing skills, and then they might come to a clinic setting and I'm going to be working with them, that I don't overgeneralize and just assume that in my life I wet the toothbrush first and then put the toothpaste on. Maybe mom is doing it a very different way. So I would encourage you that if there are multiple parties that are going to be working on teaching these skills, that you make sure that you all observe each other as well as analyze some of these task analysis just to make sure that your accuracy in order and sequence of events is present. So, it may start easily as, just simply obtaining your materials, making sure you have a toothbrush, toothpaste, and a towel, as well as being present at the sink. So for some of our individuals, we may need to actually spell out each of those materials. So within step 1, we may have an A, B, C, and D kind of phenomenon going on. Then other things, taking off the toothpaste. How would I do that? Where do I put the toothpaste cap? So for some of our individuals, that can kind of serve to trip them up because they think, well, you didn't tell me to put that down. You didn't specifically teach that part of it. So making sure that we're cognitively aware of those steps that we may need to formally assess. Another example, and this is helpful when we think about this sometimes formally by teaching younger students, but don't think about, how important it might be to get some of our older individuals to learn these types of skills, but setting the table at night. Maybe some of our kids have placemats on their table, maybe sometimes they don't. So again, analyzing your task analysis, for accuracy is important. Also, are you always going to have a butter knife every single time when you set the table, or are you always going to have a spoon or a fork? So making sure that I would encourage that even if you might not need a knife for some meals, that if you're going to be teaching them, a life skill such as setting the table, where maybe that would also be a job skill where they could work maybe in a restaurant setting, making sure that you know what the expectations are of that job requirement. Some tables are very formal in restaurants, and others may not include silverware at all. It may just have making sure that there's placemats, napkins, and a cup on the table, things like that. So just encouraging you to think through those types of things. And if you can tell, some of these task analysis are very specific. Like, for example, if you would look at steps number 8 and 9, showing exactly where the dessert spoon and fork is supposed to go, specifically saying words like horizontally at the top of the large plate, making sure that if you are teaching these types of skills, that your individual knows what horizontally means, or if you're going to model that specific step. If you're modeling it, they're obviously probably going to understand what horizontal is, but if they would have to be reading from a cue card or a prompt sequence, making sure that they understand the vocabulary that you include within that prompt hierarchy or that task analysis. We also think about specific play skills that we might be able to teach. So this one is an example about trains, but it could be other things. It might be, how do I ask to be included in a video game if I, am just arriving at a birthday party and some of my friends are participating in a game that I would like to start, be involved in as well. How might I initiate that conversation or that social exchange? So take a second to kind of look through these different steps. The other thing to kind of plan for and kind of analyze is, what are some things that might happen? Maybe it's that they're going to have to ask for those train track pieces, or maybe it's that they're going to have to ask permission of their partner to change the layout of their train track system or what have you. So just thinking through. Also, I would encourage you to, as you see on your screen, they've included words with specific quotation marks, so that way you know specifically what it is and you practice those specific words that are going to be utilized in that particular setting. That's very helpful as well. So some other considerations when we're thinking about determining what skills we're going to teach. Thinking about how we might be able to include the students' interest or learning preferences within that. I've had students I had one particular student that loved the gingerbread man, so we tried to incorporate different task analysis where we taught the gingerbread man how to do functional or daily living types of activities, and then he would simply copy those information. Or Thomas the Tank Engine, putting things into some type of train reference. Our first stop at the first train station would be step 1. Our next train stop would be step 2 or step 3, etc. Also, what are some developmental or age-appropriate activities or materials that I'm going to be able to use? As I mentioned earlier, some of our learners need actual coins when they're learning to understand the meaning of money and being able to spend those types of things, whereas other individuals, they might be able to have that play kind of money setting. Or if you're learning about a grocery store, how might you set that up? What would it look like if the child is 3 or 4 years of age versus what would that look like if I was trying to teach that at 13 or 14 years of age? The way that I would interact with them, the way that I would organize or model that particular activity obviously would look different. Also, asking yourself, under what conditions is my child or individual going to yield the most success? So obviously trying to sometimes teach a skill in a grocery store might not be the appropriate skill to actually start introducing that skill, because maybe there's a lot of people present or a lot of outside noise, or they're overwhelmed or having, a bad sensory day. So if we know that those factors may exist, being able to control for those factors in our teaching and learning environments, to make sure that we are in maybe learning environments that are more conducive for that child's learning, maybe a smaller room with no other distractions, or having a table with only the materials needed for that particular task, instead of being in more of a visually overwhelming type of situation. Sometimes many of our students learn best by actually having a peer in that environment for them to observe and imitate or copy that particular skill. And sometimes our individuals take direction better from an actual peer than they might from an adult. So that would be a different set of conditions in which, they might be more successful. So I would definitely encourage you to think more about that. The other main part that is often frequently forgotten about, or not having emphasis placed on it, is the reinforcement piece. And we know that for many of our individuals, learning these particular skills are extremely difficult. And they may not be motivated to learn these particular skills because they're not exactly sure why it's important for them to learn to brush their teeth, or why it's important for them to learn to start a conversation or participate in a social activity or game. So making sure that we have individualized reinforcement present for them, and giving them that reinforcement as they move through those tasks and learn different things. We know that by definition that reinforcement means increasing the likelihood or chances that a behavior is going to occur again. So obviously that's what we're trying to do when we're teaching these types of skills. So having those present and determining ahead of time, how often do I need to give the reinforcement? Maybe some days are going to be better than others, and there might be some days where reinforcement needs to be more frequent, whereas as they start to learn the skills, you can back off on some of that reinforcement. But it always needs to be present in some form or fashion in order for learning and motivation to remain high. The other thing to think about is what type of prompt hierarchy should I use? And my colleague Laura Ferguson did a training, a webinar, so I would encourage you to look back on that if you'd like to know more about prompting and prompt sequences. It may be that you need a full physical prompt, so hand-over-hand prompting that individual through different steps within that task analysis. Or maybe it's just going to be that they need verbal prompts or gestural prompts. So making sure that you understand at what level your individual is going to need those prompts, so that as teacher A or teacher B or teacher C or peer D that are going to be interacting and working to teach the student are all utilizing that same prompt sequence or prompt hierarchy, so that they don't become confused or easily frustrated and just want to shut down, or worse, have behavioral meltdowns because they're not sure of what expectations it is that you're requiring of them. The other step, or other thing to consider under step 4, is what procedure you will use. In the very beginning when we started, I told you about 3 different sequences that we were going to learn about to help you kind of understand how to chain together these discrete skills once that you have taught them independently. So how are we going to chain those together? So today we're going to talk about total task presentation and what that means, backward chaining, and what we call forward chaining. So with the total task presentation, the way that that's going to happen is that you're simply going to train them on each step of that task analysis during every session. That means that you're going to go through, if there's 11 steps, you're going to go through all 11 steps, and at the conclusion of those 11 steps, you're going to make sure that you give them reinforcement at the end. So you're going to provide them assistance with any steps that they need assistance with. Some steps are obviously going to require more assistance than others, but you're going to practice all 11 steps, hence the word total task presentation, every single time. With backwards chaining, this is when all the behaviors are obviously identified in the task and they're prompted except for the very last behavior in the chain. So for example, sometimes we do this when we're teaching kids like finger plays or songs or things like that. So we may say, "Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I." and then you wait for them to kind of complete, O, which would be, in this case, the last behavior in the chain. So once they complete that last behavior, then they obviously contact their reinforcement, and then you may go back over that again. But the important thing to note here is that the only task that you would require them to do independently would simply be that last behavior in the chain. So again, having them, you do all the steps for them up until the last behavior. So an example of that would be when teaching a child to tie their shoes, they will be prompted throughout the sequence and then required to complete the last step, which might simply be pulling the loops together snug on their shoe tying. So once they complete that particular tugging and pulling snug, then they would contact their reinforcement, which might be an M&M or the ability to watch a short video clip or whatever their desired reinforcement might be. The third type of chaining that we're going to talk about is forward chaining. And this is when the child is going to complete the steps independently and contact reinforcement, but the first step in the chain is going to be what they complete by themselves first. So an example of that would be, again, with the shoe tying, with shoe tying, might be the first step is just going to be to pinch the lace between their forefinger and thumb. And then they contact reinforcement. And then that teacher is going to prompt them through the additional, 10 or so steps that might be required within that task. So again, they only are required to do the very first part, and then we simply would prompt them through the additional sequences at that point. But they obtain reinforcement only after completing that first desired part of that chain together within that task. So it'd be important to think about, what's going to be best for your learner. For some of our learners, forward chaining is best simply because we're going to start at the beginning and then gradually increase what we require them to do, whereas other individuals may need kind of a jump start, like I gave you the example in the backwards chaining. Things like, learning finger plays, or sometimes even learning their phone number, to say my number is, 1-502-123-472, and then they fill in the last number. So kind of give them like a jump start or a kick start ahead. And for some of our individuals, the only way that they're going to be able to learn all of those steps is through that total task presentation, where you're going through each step and reinforcing each step individually and making sure that you're teaching all, 10, 14, however many steps that you have of that sequence at that time. So also under step 4, it's important for us to think about what evidence-based practices we're going to use to be able to teach each aspect of those chains. We know that many of our students are visual learners and they respond well to those visual supports. So how might we represent visually each of these steps within this task analysis? Also, we know that video modeling is a very strong and heavily research-based, evidence-based practice. And so watching, someone else on a video, or watching themselves on a video, or watching someone that they love engage in, a task that they need to learn is also very helpful. Also social narratives. We also sometimes refer to these as social stories. That's what Carol Gray calls them. So what social narratives are a way in which a social situation might need to be more clearly defined. So how and what expectations there are there, and how might they perform a skill specifically that they might be misreading or not understanding in that particular circumstance. Also, discrete trial teaching. That is a very formalized and systematic way to teach a very smaller, discrete type of skill. So if we were going to teach them maybe how to fold laundry, maybe it would simply be that under discrete trial teaching, we would teach them to say, we would say, do this, and we simply would fold a wash rag in half and have them imitate that specific behavior. So that would be a way you could use discrete trial teaching with task analysis. Also, time delays. That would just be simply prompting the individual to engage in a specific discrete skill, and then slowly giving them an opportunity or a pause or a time delay in order to engage in that behavior, and then providing reinforcement for that. So I would encourage you, we have a lot of webinars on a lot of these evidence-based practices, these 5 specifically that I've listed. So you can kind of take what you've learned from this task analysis and look over and reference some of those other resources also on the internet module, autism internet modules that I mentioned might be helpful as well for you to kind of put things together. I wanted to include some examples here for you to actually be able to watch. So this might be, or look at, this would be a visual example of a task analysis or visual support that we might have for washing hands. And if you think about it, many of the health departments in our local regions are actually putting these particular visual supports on mirrors in restaurants, in public restaurants, just to jog people's memory of sometimes it's not just enough to say, hey, wash your hands before going back to work. So they will have these visual images to kind of go, okay, you really need to reinforce this, and these are the steps that would be required. Also, I mentioned video modeling. You know, hand washing again, since that's a typical skill that, or a frequent skill that you might see taught within a chain or a task analysis. On this particular video, you will see an individual learning to wash her hands, but you will also see that in this particular example, a hand will come up over the camera. And once that happens, that's kind of that prompt for that individual that's watching this particular video prompt sequence to engage in that specific behavior or step that they have actually seen. So you could set up the video in a variety of ways. You know, again, you might just simply, if you're teaching using forward chaining, maybe you would simply just model the first step that would be in that hand washing procedure. So maybe it would just be simply turning the water on. And then through each of those steps, after you looked at each of those steps individually, then this video modeling example might be a way where you could chain those behaviors together. So I'm going to let you watch this example.
Okay, first you're going to turn on the water. Then you're going to wet your hands. Next, get 1 pump of soap. Then rub your hands together. Put your hands between your fingers between your fingers. Get the top of your hand, the bottoms. Sometimes I do circular motions. Next, rinse your hands. So all of the soap is off. Then turn off the water. Finally, dry your hands.
And then this would be at the point where you would provide reinforcement, making sure that, you know, for some of our students, verbal reinforcement is enough, but also sometimes pairing that with some kind of tangible reinforcement to let them know that you're, this is the way that it's supposed to go. So for other of our individuals, maybe shaving with an electric razor might be a task that you would have to model for them. And in many of our homes, sometimes we have single parents, or the mom might stay at home with their individual while their husband or significant other male counterpart goes to work. So having a model for you know, teaching a male individual how to shave may be difficult. So including that on a video such as this may be helpful. So also you'll see in this particular video that there will be blacked out spaces that would indicate a pause, which might serve as a prompt to kind of do that particular aspect, or see if maybe that individual can work ahead and guess or perform the next step in the sequence or task analysis. Whoops. I'm not sure why that's not working.
Turn on the razor. To start shaving, turn on the razor. Shave your right cheek by moving the razor in a down to up motion.
Shake off the razor in the sink to keep it clean. Shave the area around your mouth.
So you get the general idea about what that could look like. Also, I mentioned earlier using social narratives or social stories to define a social situation and what those expectations might be. So it's really important that in a social narrative that you don't simply just roll off a list of items or different steps that would be required in completing a specific task, because obviously that doesn't meet the criteria to say that it would be a social narrative. Specifically, you might want to use this example when you're teaching, a play or a social skill. So I wrote this quickly for an individual about, talking with my friends. He wanted to be able to start a conversation, but he didn't have the skills needed to know kind of where to start. So sometimes he might walk up to an individual and just kind of shove them because he wanted their attention but didn't exactly know how to start that conversational exchange. So we wrote this story for him. Talking with my friends. When I want to start a conversation with my friend, I should try to approach them and make eye contact. I may start by asking them, "How's your day going?" I may then ask them if they would like to play hide and seek with me. My friends like it when I look at them and use my words. So as you can see, we had specifically taught him within a conversational exchange that it's important to approach the individual, make eye contact with them, and then use verbal language in order to initiate that conversation, as well as to communicate with them what their specific intent or purpose or their want would be, which in this case would be to play hide and seek, which was his favorite. So those are just some examples. Obviously, you're going to have to individualize those, but I wanted to provide you with some sort of example or framework to work from. So the last part in step 5, but definitely is step 5, but it's definitely an important part, is that not only do you have to teach that skill, but you have to monitor that individual's progress. Sometimes we get so caught up in teaching the skills that we don't take a step back to make sure that growth is actually occurring. So sometimes if that growth is not occurring, maybe it's because we're trying to teach too much too fast. Maybe it's that we only need to focus on steps 1 through 3 of that sequence and getting those 3 things chained together before we work on chaining 7 different behaviors together, for example. It may be also that maybe there's certain steps that need more intense teaching on a specific aspect instead of working on chaining those skills together. Sometimes we immediately jump to chaining those skills together when we haven't spent ample time on teaching each of those steps independently. For many of our students, it may just be that they need more repetition of that skill, maybe more repetition within a specific environment, or maybe they need more repetition across settings or across different people so that they can learn that generalized aspect of things. And then also sometimes if we're not making progress, maybe we need to take a step back and pick a different method. So if we're only using visual supports and we feel like that our data is telling us that our student is not making progress, maybe we need to figure out how we might be able to utilize those video modeling to kind of take it a step further. Or maybe it's that we need to use discrete trial teaching to teach one specific aspect and have that highly repetitive part of that specific skill taught. So again, just taking time to analyze what it is that we know about our students and monitoring that to make sure that we as the teacher don't need to be making accommodations or teaching that to them in a different way. These are some references that are included, so feel free to jump into those. At this time, I will be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Okay, I don't see any questions so far. We can wait a few more minutes for anybody to type in the questions in the question box. Okay, Michelle, I don't see any other questions or any questions asked today.
Okay. If anyone has any further questions, you're welcome to email me at michelle.antle@louisville.edu.
All right, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If you would like to view today's webinar again, it will be posted on our YouTube channel. That's KY Autism Training. We also have over 70 other videos available, webinar trainings available on our YouTube channel as well. Thank you for attending and have a great day. And thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.